Gästebeteiligung anschauen. Welche Gäste stellst du uns jetzt vor in dem ersten Impuls-Dialog, Zoe? Ich glaube, wir haben Dr. Irene Antoni-Komar bei uns. Sie kommt jetzt auf die Bühne und Professor Dr. Uwe Schneidewind. Guten Tag. Herzlich willkommen, es hat alles geklappt, wunderbar. 10:19 Uhr, wir haben sogar noch eine extra Minute rausgeschlagen. In der Einladung haben wir darauf hingewiesen, dass es zur Umsetzung der Agenda 2030 auf kommunaler Ebene bereits für alle Handlungsfelder in den Kommunen funktionierende Strukturen gibt. Allein im Bereich Ernährung hinken wir noch ein bisschen hinterher. Ist es denn so, dass hier kein Handlungsbedarf besteht oder haben wir was ganz Wichtiges vergessen?
Ja, und da möchte ich doch direkt an unsere Gäste diese Frage weiterreichen. Haben wir was vergessen? Herr Dr. Schneidewind, Sie sind seit vergangenem November Oberbürgermeister der Stadt Wuppertal und waren davor lange Zeit wissenschaftlicher Leiter des Wuppertal-Instituts und auch noch Rektor der Hochschule, der Universität Oldenburg, Verzeihung. Sie kennen also beide Seiten und Ihr Thema ist ja die große Transformation, das dürfte sehr vielen Menschen bekannt sein. Ich frage mich dabei, brauchen wir denn nicht auch für diese große Transformation eine Transformation des Ernährungssystems, um die Agenda 2030 zu erfüllen? Also wie dürfen wir uns das vorstellen und wo sehen Sie da die hauptsächlichen Punkte?
Ja, vielen Dank. Wunderschönen guten Morgen auch von meiner Seite aus. Ja, für mich ist das ja wirklich jetzt eine interessante auch Transformation. Sie sprachen das an. Wir haben ja 2018 zu diesem Thema große Transformation ein ganzes Kompendium vorgelegt und die Ernährungswende war da eine der 7 Schlüsselwenden, die wir thematisiert haben. Also ich glaube, die Ernährungswende ist für all das, was wir im Bereich Klima, SDGs erreichen wollen, eine ganz zentrale. Für mich ist es jetzt spannend zu sehen, auf der kommunalen Seite angekommen, was das doch für eine Herausforderung darstellt, dieses Thema in kommunalen Strukturen abzubilden, weil es eben in so viele Bereiche hineinreicht. Ne? Also es ist so ein klassisches, ressortübergreifendes Thema und das macht es dann in den Kommunen eben wirklich so herausfordernd. Selbst wenn man, wie wir auch im Wuppertal, viele hochinteressante Einzelbausteine hat, die dann zu einer Gesamtstrategie zu fügen. Wir kommen da ja vielleicht im Gespräch auch nochmal drauf, weil man kann das nutzen in Feldern der Wirtschaftsentwicklung, der Quartiersentwicklung. Es hat ganz viel mit Schulen und Kita-Themen zu tun. Wir haben im Hinblick jetzt auch auf den sozialen Ausgleich in der Stadt Tafelbewegung. Also Ernährung, überall spielt es eine Rolle, aber es gibt eben kaum die Instanz, in der das strategisch gemeinsam gedacht wird. Und darum habe ich mich jetzt über die Einladung heute auch sehr gefreut, weil wir das eben jetzt versuchen, auch im Wuppertal konsequenter auf den Weg zu bringen.
Oh, das klingt doch sehr spannend. Das heißt, Wuppertal direkt in der Nähe von Köln, vor der Haustür sozusagen. Da haben wir wahrscheinlich sehr die Gelegenheit, das uns auch sehr gut anzuschauen. Sie haben jetzt die Kommunen angesprochen. Es gibt natürlich noch einen weiteren Bereich, der sehr stark eben gerade die Ernährungssysteme auch gestaltet. Das ist die Wirtschaft und ich möchte ganz herzlich auch begrüßen Frau Dr. Irene Antoni-Komar. Frau Dr. Antoni-Komar, Sie sind seit mehr als 5 Jahren Koordinatorin der Forschungsprojektreihe Nascent an der Uni Oldenburg. Und Nascent bedeutet neue Chancen für eine nachhaltige Ernährungswirtschaft durch transformative Wirtschaftsformen. Das heißt also, wir fragen uns, wo sehen Sie oder wo zeigt auch das Projekt in diesem Szenario, in der derzeitigen Situation die Chance für die Gestaltung durch eine nachhaltige Ernährungswirtschaft?
Ja, schönen guten Morgen von meiner Seite auch. Sie hatten ja eben schon dieses für uns wichtige Projekt Nascent erwähnt und da geht es tatsächlich nicht um die großen Wirtschaftsunternehmen, sondern um die vielen kleinen lokalen Initiativen, weil wir zu Beginn des Projektes davon ausgegangen sind und es hat sich dann auch bestätigt, dass genau diese diese kleinen, lokalen, kooperativen Initiativen ein immenses Veränderungspotenzial besitzen. Und ich möchte so sagen, auch nach der Rede von Frau Reger sind wir eigentlich hier mittendrin in einem guten Beispiel, weil Köln ja sich mit dem Ernährungsrat so ganz früh aufgemacht hat, also diese kooperativen kleinen Ansätze auch zu bündeln und in einem Netzwerk zu unterstützen und für die Kommune fruchtbar zu machen. Ich erinnere mich auch sehr gern daran, dass Anna Wissmann in unserem ersten Nascent-Projekt Praxispartnerin war und eben auch diese Perspektive mit eingebracht hat. Also was sind kleine kooperative Initiativen. Das fängt an mit Urban Gardening Projekten, zivilgesellschaftlich initiiert, wo Menschen eben ihre Ernährung zurückholen in die Stadt, in die Kommune und wieder selber praktisch tätig werden. Also sich der Protest an dem globalen Ernährungssystem wirklich praktisch niederschlägt und sichtbar wird. Und das haben wir dann eben auch als Mikropolitiken bezeichnet, weil dort das Widerständige deutlich wird. Dann haben wir solche Projekte untersucht wie Mietäcker, in denen Menschen dann ein kleines Stück Land mieten und dort ihr Gemüse anbauen und sich auch wieder neu befähigen für die Ernährungsproduktion. Oder weitergehend dann eben auch Erzeuger-Verbrauchergemeinschaften bis hin zu solidarischer Landwirtschaft. Und darin sehen wir eben auch ein ganz großes Potenzial, weil solidarische Landwirtschaft alles das umfasst, auch was sich ändern muss, nämlich die Versorgung wieder verantwortlich zu gestalten und sich damit verantwortlich zu beschäftigen und auch Risiken zu teilen. Also dass nicht Landwirte das Risiko alleine tragen, sondern dass wir als Verbraucherinnen und Verbraucher zu Co-Produzenten werden und durch unsere Finanzierung das landwirtschaftliche Risiko kontinuierlich unterstützen und dadurch natürlich auch unseren Beitrag leisten für die Transformation der Ernährungswirtschaft.
Das ist ja durchaus ein sehr interessanter Befund. Sagen wir jetzt mal so, die herkömmliche Meinung könnte ja eher sein, die großen Akteure in einem solchen Netzwerk haben auch eine besonders große Gestaltungsmacht. Ich würde jetzt gerne mal an Sie beide die Frage richten, wie bewerten Sie das im Vergleich? Also haben diese Organisationsformen, diese neuartigen, auch kooperativen Strukturen, gibt es da tatsächlich ein transformatives Potenzial zu entdecken? Wie sehen Sie das?
Weil die sind ja in der Regel wirklich auch Treiber und Motoren dann für Entwicklungen auch in der erweiterten Ernährungsbranche. Also wir merken das ja, Irene hat das ja, Irene, echt schön, dass wir uns auf der Ebene mal wiedersehen. Wir haben ja sehr eng auch in Oldenburg zusammengearbeitet. Irene hat das ja auch sehr deutlich gemacht, dass ja auch, das wird hier immer mehr zum Teil einer urbanen Lebensqualität und Kultur. Ne? Der Anspruch ist da, also gerade auch die urbanen Vorreitermilieus, die möchten Ernährung, die aus der Region kommt, die ökologischen, biologischen Standards gehorcht. Und darauf springen natürlich zunehmend auch die großen Handelsketten ein. Ja? Und wir durchaus jetzt auch in der kommunalen Entwicklungspolitik, also wenn man Filialen großer Discounter neu plant und überlegt, unter welchen Randbedingungen lässt man sie zu, jetzt auch auf einer ganz anderen Verhandlungsebene ist. Ja? Und das ist natürlich vorbereitet worden durch all diese Vorreiterunternehmen. Und die große spannende Frage ist ja, wie werden die, wenn jetzt die Großen drauf anspringen, da zum Teil auch wieder rausgedrängt. Ne? Und das ist natürlich ein hoch relevantes Spannungsverhältnis. Aber diese transformative Kraft der Pioniere und dieser hochinteressanten dezentralen und kleinteiligen Strukturen, die ist auf jeden Fall vorhanden. Also würde ich das schon einschätzen.
Vielleicht kann ich da auch gleich nochmal anschließen. Es wird ja häufig gesagt, naja, diese Pioniere, die agieren nur in der Nische und das hat jetzt nicht unbedingt so ein also transformatives, weitreichendes Potenzial. Aber andererseits ist es ja auch so, dass wir die Bündnisse und Netzwerke beobachten, die Pioniere aus der Nische herausbringen und sozusagen in den, also wie man in der Wissenschaft dann sagt, in das Regime oder in das Mainstream-Feld bringen und dadurch ihnen auch einen Raum verschaffen, um sich weiterzuentwickeln und aktiv zu werden. Und wir haben natürlich auch immer diese Konfrontation mit den Großen, bei uns den, wie man so sagt, den Big Four, den Handelsketten oder global gesehen, das ist auch eine Zahl, die ich wirklich erschreckend finde, tragen 100 Konzerne 75% zur verpackten Lebensmittelindustrie bei. Und dem zu begegnen, ist natürlich wie so ein Kampf David gegen Goliath. Und die Davids eben groß zu machen, zu unterstützen. Und genau da können Kommunen ansetzen, wenn sie diese kleinen Initiativen stärken und in ihre Ernährungsstrategie integrieren. Ja, das, denke ich, ist eine ganz wichtige Aufgabe der kommunalen Politik, also die Graswurzelbewegung zu integrieren in eine größere Ernährungsstrategie.
Kann ich dazu vielleicht noch eine Frage stellen an Sie beide? Als Verbraucher haben wir ja wirklich jeden Tag die Wahl. Wir treffen bis zu 100 Entscheidungen jeden Tag für oder gegen ein Produkt. Und wenn wir uns für ein Produkt vom regionalen Bauernmarkt entscheiden, dann entscheiden wir uns gegen 99 andere. Wie ist es auf kommunaler Ebene? Wie kann sowas funktionieren? Also Beispiel Wuppertal. Sie nehmen diesen Prozess jetzt, Sie gehen den Prozess an. Wir reden ja hier von ganz anderen Quantitäten. Also wie bekommen Sie in Wuppertal in Kitas und in Schulen regionale oder gute Bioprodukte? Wie kann das funktionieren? Weil die kleinteiligen Initiativen, die können ja dem Verbraucher im Einzelnen helfen, aber in so einem Großabnehmer wie einer Kommune, wie kann das zusammengehen?
Ja, also ich glaube, das ist ja für die Kommunen, jetzt gerade für Kommunen unter einem erheblichen, auch finanziellen Druck, wie wir das in Wuppertal sind, ist das eben eine Riesenherausforderung, ne? Also weil das natürlich tagtäglich in einem Konflikt steht, solche Entscheidungen dann auch auf einer politischen Ebene durchzusetzen. Und darum spielt diese Umfeldentwicklung, dass man eben erkennt, Ernährung ist eigentlich auf ganz vielen Ebenen Stadtentwicklungsthema und damit auch den politischen Raum dann bereitet, um am Ende den Boden dafür zu haben, auch sehr, sehr konsequent auf der Ebene von Schulen und Kitas das umzustellen. Bei den Kitas haben wir natürlich den Vorteil, dass wir da in der freien Trägerstruktur auch zum Teil sehr stark unterwegs sind. Da kann man sagen, eher auch Pioniere adressieren. Im Schulbereich sind wir natürlich als Kommune alleine gefordert. Aber unsere Strategie in den kommenden Monaten eben sein wird, das mehr durch die Aufladung des Ernährungsthemas an sich den Boden zu bereiten, deutlich zu machen, das ist ein Stadt-Land-Entwicklungsthema, ne? Diese Kopplung mit solidarischer Landwirtschaft in den umliegenden Kreisen. Es ist ein Quartiersentwicklungsintegrationsthema, ne? Wir haben Vorreiterquartiere, die dann solche neben Restaurant-Days, solche schönen Aktionen machen wie der Geschmack meiner Kindheit und damit wird sich Integrationsarbeit leisten, ähnlich wie wir es bei vielen Urban Gardening-Projekten erleben. Es ist aber durchaus auch ein Wirtschaftsentwicklungsthema. Wir haben den Anspruch hier in Wuppertal, Circular Valley in Zukunft zu werden, diese Kreislaufthemen. Da muss ich natürlich auf die Frage auch Verpackung im Ernährungsbereich, in unserem Essverhalten jetzt gerade in Corona achten. Und damit hat man dann hoffentlich eine Kulisse, in Haushaltsverhandlungen, in den politischen Mehrheiten auch dann das Brot- und Buttergeschäft, eben konsequente Umstellungen in den Kitas und Schulen auf den Weg zu bringen. Und das ist ja neben den finanziellen Fragen auch durchaus auch ein kulturelles Mitnehmen. Ne? Also denn, Ernährungsverhalten ist ja nun sehr, sehr früh gelernt. Und wenn man dann das Gefühl hat, da soll jetzt umerzogen werden im Hinblick auf den Geschmack bestimmter bürgerlicher Eliten, haben sie natürlich da auch ganz, ganz viel Widerstand, gerade in so einer bunten und diversen Stadt, wie wir es hier in Wuppertal sind.
Ja, ich greife vielleicht nochmal meinen Lieblingsbereich stehender Kultur auf, was Uwe Schneidewind eben angeschnitten hat. Das ist ja auch ein ganz zentraler Bereich bei der Transformation, nämlich das Lernen, sich wieder neu mit Ernährung auseinanderzusetzen und wieder zu befähigen. Und nicht nur auf individueller, sondern auch auf kollektiver Ebene. Das betrifft ja durchaus dann auch die Außerhausverpflegung, Gemeinschaftsverpflegung, bei der die Köchinnen und Köche, also die Anforderungen, die heute gestellt werden, nämlich mehr pflanzenbasiert sich zu ernähren, regional, saisonale Produkte zu verwenden, möglichst wenig hochverarbeitete Produkte einzusetzen, also das Stichwort Convenience abzubauen und eben wieder zu den Rohprodukten zurückzukommen. Und da spielt eben dieser ganze kulturelle Kontext eine ganz wichtige Rolle. Und in dem Zusammenhang ist, glaube ich, auch nochmal ein wichtiger Aspekt für Kommunen, also die sogenannte Krise des Handwerks, die Unterstützung von Ernährungshandwerk, also man denkt nur an das Sterben, gibt es ja nicht nur bei Höfen, also bei kleinen Höfen zugunsten großer Monokulturen, sondern das findet ja auch auf handwerklicher Ebene statt, bei Bäckereien, Metzgereien und so weiter, wo wir dann im Grunde auch eine Einheitsproduktpalette nur noch haben und die Vielfalt immer mehr verloren geht. Also das ist so diese kulturelle Dimension, die neben der ökologischen, ökonomischen, sozialen auch eine ganz zentrale darstellt.
Ich würde ganz gerne noch mal eingehen auf das Ernährungsthema als Stadtentwicklungsthema, auch als Stadt-Land-Entwicklungsthema für kulturell diverse Städte. Wir haben jetzt gehört, es gibt diese Pioniere und sie verbünden sich zu Netzwerken. Jetzt haben wir sehr viele Vertreterinnen und Vertreter aus der kommunalen Politik und der Verwaltung hier präsent. Da frage ich mich doch, wie kann man da Synergien schaffen? Wie können wir diese Pioniere der Nachhaltigkeit oder der nachhaltigen Ernährung verbünden mit den kommunalen Entscheiderinnen und Entscheidern? Wo sind Hebelpunkte? Wo kann gemeinsam angesetzt werden? Und was wird dann möglich? Das heißt, wollen wir mal ein bisschen in die Zukunft schauen, was könnte denn dann passieren, wenn sich diese Menschen miteinander zusammentun und gute Ideen entwickeln?
Ja, ich glaube, die Herausforderung ist eben wirklich die Frage, wo hänge ich das in der Stadt auf? Also das merke ich jetzt ja auch durch diesen Rollenwechsel, dass das zwar gut ist, dem eine hohe Symbolwirkung an der Stadtspitze zu geben, aber das natürlich ins Leere fällt, wenn dann keine Verbindung in den weiterführenden Arbeitsstrukturen da ist. Also wir haben bei uns jetzt die sehr gute Situation, dass wir ein Dezernat mit einem hoch engagierten Dezernenten haben, in dem Wirtschaft, Nachhaltigkeit und Stadtentwicklung zusammengefasst sind. Ne? Also wo man dann plötzlich wirklich einen Ort hat, der nicht nur beim Oberbürgermeister liegt, sondern der auch wirklich auf einer Dezernatsebene das verankert hat und dort jetzt wir dabei sind, in den nächsten Monaten auch eine Nachhaltigkeitsstrategie für Wuppertal auszuarbeiten. Wir hängen da ein bisschen zurück, da gibt es ja andere Kommunen, die sind schon sehr viel weiter. Jetzt für so ein Ernährungsthema ist es durchaus ein Vorteil, weil wir sowas dann wirklich mit diesen unterschiedlichen Aspekten, Ernährungspolitik als Nachhaltigkeitsbeitrag, als Stadtentwicklungsbeitrag, als Regionalentwicklungsbeitrag, als Wirtschaftsmotor an einem Ort verankern können, wo eigentlich die unterschiedlichen und viele der unterschiedlich relevanten Bereiche jetzt schon vernetzt sind. Und das muss, glaube ich, jede Kommune selber so ein Stück schauen, wo ist ein kraftvoller Hebelpunkt in der Verwaltung, aber dann natürlich auch in den politischen Strukturen, um das voranzubringen. Ne? Denn gerade bei diesen sperrigen Themen, am Ende hängt das dann wirklich an Akteurinnen und Akteuren, die mit einer gewissen Durchsetzungskraft das dann in eine Stadt mit hineintragen.
Frau Antoni-Komar, möchten Sie da vielleicht
Ja, gerne. Ich denke, wir wechseln uns einfach so ab, ne? Also wir sind da eine ganz wichtige Mittlerfunktion zwischen Zivilgesellschaft und Kommune in den Ernährungsräten. Wir bezeichnen Ernährungsräte oder eben auch andere Zusammenschlüsse als Systemdienstleister, ne? Weil in den Ernährungsräten bündelt sich ja das, was die neue Ernährungsbewegung ausmacht, nämlich das der demokratische Prozess der Veränderung, das Partizipative, und damit ist es ein ganz zentraler Vermittler zu den kommunalen, recht strikten Strukturen, kann man auch sagen. Und um das eben auf Dauer zu stellen, braucht es eine Finanzierung, die auch auf Dauer gestellt ist. Das beobachten wir ja bei vielen Ernährungsratsinitiativen, also wir sehen das hier in Oldenburg, dass von Jahr zu Jahr die Finanzierung der Koordination wieder neu verhandelt wird und unsicher ist, ob jetzt die Bewilligung wieder erfolgt von Seiten der Stadt. Und dass es da eine Kontinuität der Finanzierung gibt, um eben auch die Kontinuität der Zusammenarbeit sicherzustellen. Das, denke ich, ist eine ganz wichtige zukünftige Aufgabe, die zu erledigen und zu institutionalisieren wäre.
Dann wünschen wir Ihnen beiden sehr viel Erfolg in Ihren jeweiligen Funktionen. Herr Schneidewind, Sie haben jetzt die Seiten gewechselt und ich bin sehr gespannt, was in Wuppertal vorangehen wird die nächsten Jahre. Und das war jetzt ein sehr interessanter erster Einblick in den Hebel, die Kommunen haben und in die Möglichkeiten. Frau Antoni-Komar, vielen Dank, dass Sie Zeit sich genommen haben für uns. Und wir sehen uns später in der Fragerunde. Die findet ja dann ab 11:45 Uhr nach der Kaffeepause statt in Raum 1 mit Ihnen beiden. Und dann kann das Publikum wirklich mit Ihnen nochmal interagieren und sehr viele Fragen loswerden. Ganz konkret, das Publikum würde ich an dieser Stelle bitten, die Fragen zu sammeln. Und wenn Sie nachher noch Fragen stellen möchten, kommen Sie in Raum 1 ab 11:45 Uhr und die beiden werden Ihnen Rede und Antwort stehen. Vielen Dank, dass Sie da waren. Zoe, the floor is yours.
Ja, von mir ganz herzlichen Dank und wir sehen uns dann um 11:45 Uhr.
Genau. Vielen Dank, Zoe, und bis gleich. Dann würde ich jetzt unseren Kollegen Steven Leitheiser von der Universität in Groningen zu mir bitten. Steven, what are we going to discuss in our next dialogue in English?
Yes, so our next dialogue is going to be about citizen participation. So what roles can citizens play? What roles are they already playing? And just to sort of see what's already happening on the ground. And for that, we're going to invite on the stage Jessica Duncan, who is Associate Professor in the Politics of Sustainable Food System Transformation at Wageningen University in the Netherlands, and Martin Krivits, who is a researcher at the Research Institute for Agriculture, Fisheries and Food in Ghent. So welcome, Jessica and Martin.
Great to be here.
Did I miss anything there in your titles? I got everything. Okay. All right. So yeah, let's just go ahead and start with the first question that I mentioned. The session is about the role of citizens in the sustainable food system. So maybe Jessica first, what role can citizens play? And maybe more importantly, what role are they already playing?
Wow, huge question. I think citizens are already playing a really diverse number of roles. And I really like that this conference is focusing on citizens rather than consumers or individuals, because citizens comes with this idea of responsibility, and that's an obligation. And this is really important to remember. From my perspective, just to give a bit of context, I study policy. I'm very interested in policy processes, so you might not be surprised to know that I think citizens have a very key role to play in influencing municipal and urban food policy strategies and food policy processes. I think there are also, within that, two very important roles that citizens have to take on. The first is being very concrete as they can, about their visions for the future, their desires, their values, their food cultures. And the second is playing a key role holding governments accountable. We often forget about that second role. We put so much emphasis on, focusing on the policy, getting the right policy, but policy isn't necessarily action. And there's a really important role for, for citizens to play on that second piece, holding governments accountable, continuing to push for the policies and the food futures that they want.
Yeah, and one thing you touched on there is like the difference between citizens and consumers. And I think that's a role that's often blurred. And maybe Martin, you have researched quite a bit about democratic theory as well. Could you tell us what your understanding of citizenship is, and maybe define what the difference is between a citizen and a consumer?
Well, yes, indeed. We often tend to, when we look at the food system and when we are engaging with the public, there's often still an image of the food consumer. And I think shifting towards another way of thinking, towards food citizenship, and towards really emphasizing the role citizens can take up, an active role they can take up in the food system. This really is like a shift in perception as well. I think that there's still a kind of persistence of our self-image as a consumer, and that this cannot be underestimated in terms of the role that citizens play. There's even been this research that I've been looking into, where they did a kind of dilemma, like an experiment, where they posed a collective problem, and what came out of the experiment was that when people were primed with the word as such consumer, that they tended to have more individual behavior. So I think that merely when we reduce our agency to only thinking in terms of buying and selling, this is what we associate with being a consumer, that we miss out on a lot of potential active engagement of citizens. And I think that role of citizens, in that sense, needs to be activated. And cities can play a role in that by looking at what is already happening in their city. But I think they also can play a role by engaging with citizens. For instance, if a city has a local food strategy, to communicate that local food strategy and to put some agency, to put some responsibility, to put some effort into having a dialogue with residents in order for them to become thinking in terms of citizens rather than consumers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Martin. And Jessica, do you have some thoughts on that as well, about how we should think about citizens?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to follow up because I think Martin's point about how we've sort of trained ourselves to think of ourselves as consumers and the kind of language that we hear in many of these food policy processes really reinforces that. So we're often taught to, for example, vote with our forks. And that sounds so compelling because it kind of brings in this idea of citizenship. But what it's actually positioning us as people who can afford to buy stuff. It's still a consumer narrative, and that really starts to erase really important questions around income and power. Mm-hmm. I think the second thing that we tend to do is also talk about, but if people just have enough education, they'll become better citizens. And I also am all in favor of more food systems education, but it's such a tricky thing to say. I hold a PhD in food policy. I work at one of the top universities working on food in the world, mm-hmm. and I stand in the grocery aisle overwhelmed with trying to make the right decision. So I think in focusing on the citizen, I don't think we should lose sight of the importance of focusing also on these structural issues that provide improved structures for decision making for citizens. And the third and last point, if I may, is there are also important gender dynamics here. When we talk about improving the food system, when we talk about being better citizens, a lot of that actual work, a lot of that practice falls on women. And so I think we also need to be quite concerned, or at least aware what we're asking for when we ask for, more local food to be bought and produced and consumed and prepared. Who does that work? Well, it would be great if it was more equal. So there's sort of that dynamic. But I think too often we talk about, the going back to this beautiful mealtime and living our values. And that doesn't happen outside of the kinds of social structures that we live in. So being aware of that is key.
yeah, not everybody has the time and the resources for that.
No.
Yeah, that brings us to our next question, which is looking at this distinction between different types of participation. So on the one hand, there's what's called invited spaces of participation. This is a participatory process which the government sort of shapes, or you could also consider being a consumer as an invited space of participation. And to contrast that with invented spaces of participation is more like the things we're seeing in food policy councils or in community-supported agriculture, where citizens are innovating and designing their own contributions, making an active or taking an active role in shaping the food system they want to see. So how can we better recognize invented spaces and maybe integrate them more into urban food governance?
Martin?
Yes. I really like your question about the relationship between invited spaces and invented spaces. And so there is, depending on the political structure in the city, there's a different relationship between those two spaces. And maybe I would just like to give one example where you have citizens becoming more aware of what is happening in their city. And in a sense, what they do is they make themselves invited. So in a sense, they knock on the door of the policymakers and they say, hey, we are concerned with a public issue. And for instance, in the city of Ghent, where I'm also a resident, I have been also as a researcher into the topic of public lands, but also as a citizen. So I'm taking this double role of researcher and citizen. And as a citizen collective, we have there was a collective concern that a lot of public lands that were owned by the city were sold. So they were sold in the private market, and in a short amount of time, about 1,500 hectares of the 3,000 hectares that the city has in the past acquired or been given, has been sold. So these citizens, they concerned this as a problem, and they said, wait a minute, city, please take some time to reflect on what you can do, because you also have a local food strategy, and maybe you can use those public lands in order for local farmers to produce for the city, to set up an economically viable community support agriculture, where links are being made with the social function that because the land is owned by the social service department. So, but as a consequence, what this collective of citizens did, they wrote an open letter, and it was signed by more than 600 residents. There were a lot of organizations that signed, and this led to a reaction. It signaled something to the city. The media picked it up. Political parties also engaged, both that were in the coalition as well as in the opposition, and it became a topic. And as a result, there is now some opening towards a land policy in the city, where where there is a 2-year process to make a vision. So hopefully this could lead towards a real politically legitimate document. But if I think the citizen collectives wouldn't have knocked on the door, they would not also, the topic of public lands would also not have been invited or welcome in the political structure, to say so, of the city, or in the city council, for instance.
Yeah, that's an important point. I think one way I've talked about that is that citizens sometimes need to become sparring partners with their governments instead of spectators, and kind of really demand that more active role. And maybe that brings us to some more of something that Jessica has worked on before, which is sort of how conflict and disagreement play a role in policy, and maybe how this can even be a productive thing. So Jessica, maybe could you talk about conflict in policy and participation and how that can be productive?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been studying this at the local level more recently, but done most of my fieldwork at the global level. And what we've noticed is that when you can create autonomous civil society mechanisms or autonomous networks of citizens who are respected by the formal policy body, so the sort of invited space and the created space, or what did you call it, invented space, are recognize each other as sparring partners. I like that term a lot. I would call them sort of opponents, like in a chess match. When they recognize the legitimacy of one another, you can actually create space for disagreement and conflict. And if you have the mechanisms in place, then that disagreement allows you to kind of open up conversations that allow us to move beyond the low-hanging fruit, because this becomes a very difficult tension when we come to citizen organizations involved in policy making. Citizens have the benefit of being able to think big and push for values and push for very normative ideas. Governments also have that opportunity, but there's a number of constraints that include budgets and policy agendas and various things that they have to manage. And what tends to happen in policymaking processes around things as value laden as our food system is that we go for what we can agree on. And that's why we see a lot of vote with your fork campaigns and a lot of educate the youth campaigns, which are so valuable and important, but limited for the reasons I already said. And when you open up space for debate or dialogue or sparring, you open up space to identify what the tensions are, and then you can start to push forward on the more contentious issues. And if you create mechanisms like we've seen at the global level, for example, through the Committee on World Food Security, where you identify very clearly quotas and constituencies to ensure that people are represented in important ways, and you prioritize particular voices of those who will be most affected by the policy processes, and you understand that this will not be efficient, this will be messy, it's not necessarily personal, but you get if we get over this idea that policymaking is efficient rather than democratic debate, then we can really start to open up and identify values. And that also helps to mention trade-offs and come to sort of more transparent understanding of what's at stake when we make policy for food systems.
Yeah, great. I think you made a lot of really good points there. And that conscious recognition of maybe different constituencies or different stakeholders, that's a really important thing going forward. And then that also brings us to our next question, which is something we already mentioned earlier, is that not everybody has capacities or resources that enable active participation. So really at a municipality level, or at an urban level, what conditions could enable more inclusion, and how could participation become more inviting to all people? Martin, why don't you give us your thoughts on that first?
Yeah, well, I think municipalities and their policies play a huge role in this. Are they aware of the different voices in their city, and do they have the procedures in order to be aware? And I think often this reflection does not happen, I think, within the municipality. But there are some instruments, political instruments, deliberative instruments that are gaining traction, that are becoming more popular, that I think would be very useful to consider also in this forum. And I would like to just give one example, also relating the example to how we can invite all voices at the table. And that's the example of the participatory budgeting. So participatory budgeting, there you want to, as a city, as a municipality, you have some budget that you give towards your citizens to engage local communities, to organize local sustainable projects. Often what you see is that this is a learning process. If cities use this tool of participatory budgeting, I'd like to give the example again of the city where I live. There has been a first round of participatory budgeting. About more than 1 million euros has been invested. About 17 proposals were granted. But one key lesson that they learned when they evaluated these citizen projects is that there was a lack of, or there was a difficulty, a struggle of the citizens themselves in order to make a connection with other social groups or with vulnerable groups. And in the second round that is going on now, they are doing a kind of experiment where they work with a kind of neighborhood panels. So the proposals are on the neighborhood level or on the neighborhood level, and they have invited 20 people that are representative of all the communities and all the backgrounds in the neighborhood, and they are guiding the citizens into how can we make a connection better with, for instance, people from a different religious background, people from a different cultural background, different people who are living in a different world, basically. And this is like a very, I think, smart way to try to make citizens self-aware of how they can make a bridge across social groups and backgrounds. So yeah, these instruments I think are important, and making them more inclusive is a challenge.
Yep, for sure. And we just have a couple minutes left, but maybe Jessica, do you want to give some last thoughts on that question too?
Yeah, I'd love to, because I think this point that Martin raised in the example is excellent. Although it does tap into a debate that's happening again at the global level right now about how we get all voices at the table and if we actually want all voices at the table. I think another part of community organizing is exclusion, that we can't have everybody at the table. And when we look at the academic literature, there's this idea of the all effective principle, so everybody should be around the table, or the most effective principle, which prioritizes through concrete categories and quotas the particular kinds of actors or representatives of community groups that should be at the table to ensure that there's not an overrepresentation of particular voices. Because we do know that one of the challenges of current food policy processes, they tend to attract a certain kind of person. They look a lot like myself. So looking and challenging the all effective principle with the idea of the most effective principle, and that involves mapping and working and trusting communities, could be a neat step forward to sort of answer the second part of Martin's point.
Okay, yes, lots of important stuff there to break down, and hopefully we can get back to some of those points in the workshops in the afternoon. But for now, I think we have to go back to Christine, and we will go to the next.
Yeah, and I would like to ask the audience to get all the questions and come back later for the Q&A session after 11:45 in room 3. If you want to meet Jessica and Martin, they will be around and have like 45 minutes to answer all your questions. Thanks for being here, Jessica and Martin. And I see you later in the afternoon also in the pitching workshops. And I would like to thank my colleague, Stephen. Stephen, I see you later on stage. And welcome my wonderful colleague, Anna Wissmann, who is going to introduce us to Henk Rating and Franziska Wolf. Yeah, Anna.
Yes, hello.
Two wonderful guests here. Welcome, Franziska. Welcome, Henk. Franziska is from the Öko Institute, which doesn't have a English proper translation, but she's head of division environmental law and governance at the Institute of Öko Institute, which is applied ecology. And Henk is a lecturer and researcher in urban food systems, and he is from the IRS Hogeschool in Almere. Welcome you both, and thanks for being here.
Thanks for inviting us.
Yes, thank you very much.
Anna, what are we going to discuss in our third Impuls dialogue here?
So for this third dialogue, we are looking at another way that food is a cross-cutting issue. We've already heard quite a bit in the previous panels about collaborations and alliances and various important actors. For example, civil society and also the food economy and their relations or possible relations to local politics. And now we're going to look at food as a cross-cutting issue in local politics or in local government related to the collaboration between cities and their surrounding countryside, which is usually under a different government structure. Usually you have a city surrounded by several rural districts, and how can they collaborate? And then also within especially large city administrations, you usually have a silo effect with the different departments that tend not to be constructed in such a way, or that tend not to be meant to work together. They all have their separate working areas. And in both of those cases, we also need collaboration. So we'll be looking at both the obstacles, but also the possibilities, and possibly some also already some positive examples of how this can actually happen. So I'd like to start with the first question to Franziska Wolf. We've just been hearing about synergies that arise when new forms of organization, in this case civil society or economic organizations, join forces with local government. So you, as part of the Urban-Rural Nexus project, you have researched collaboration at the regional level between cities and their rural counterparts, basically. And you have developed policy recommendations for sustainable and integrated development of urban and rural areas. What would be the main insights from that project that you could share?
Well, that's a big question. Let me start with how can municipalities and their surrounding the surrounding countryside, the surrounding smaller municipalities, how can they get in touch? How can they cooperate? In the project that you just mentioned, Rural Urban Nexus project that was funded by the German Environment Agency, Umweltbundesamt, we looked into those cooperation structures, and independent of the issue area, so food systems was only one aspect that we covered. And we found that there is actually quite a lot of existing structures that can theoretically be used also for food policies. So the typical structures that exist already are informal cooperation within regions, such as the European metropolitan regions or Regiopol regions. And a new instrument here on the informal level are food councils, of course. And then you've got formal cooperation within regions, for example, intermunicipal working groups, regional associations, such as the region of Hanover and the region of Stuttgart. And you also have special purpose associations, Zweckverbände, but those to date are mainly used like for issues such as public transport. They haven't been used, to my knowledge, for food policies. So you can use those existing structures to come together, and you can just outreach in an informal way to all those other surrounding municipalities coming from the city perspective. And then I think an important thing is to take stock together, review the status quo, get an overview of what are the production supply structures with regard to food in the region, what are trends, etc. So you need to discuss this regionally, and then discuss what is your grasp of the region at all. So what is the spatial definition of the food system? So maybe that as a starter.
Thank you. And I would like to also give a first question to Henk. You have been both on the on the research side, on the science side of this question for a long time, but you've also collected practical experience through the Dutch City Deal. Dutch City Deal, Food on the Urban Agenda is the food title, where I think 12 cities in the Netherlands have been working together, and you have been the coordinator there, as well as, I would think, watching what is developing there as a scientist. So I would be curious about your perspective and what you have found in terms of why food and agriculture can be such a powerful linking tool, both in terms of linking between sectors or linking between issue areas, but also, of course, between cities or between cities and their neighboring regions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Anna. Yeah, I think that's a very good question, and it's very interesting to look at the experience of the City Deal in that respect. But I would maybe also first want to go back to the more general question of why is it so important that food is a cross-cutting topic? Because I think it's very important to realize that there to a large extent is also the key of the transformative power of food. We are facing a crisis of the food system in all kinds of respects, in terms of economic sustainability, environmental sustainability, health sustainability. And one way or another, because of that, food has become connected to all kinds of new policy agendas. Food was previously only something for, well, mostly rural governments and linked to agricultural policy, but now food is also a topic for sustainable development, for climate policy, for health, for social inclusion. And a lot of the dynamics and innovation, I think, has to do with that, because it also means that all kind of new social and policy actors have entered the arena. People who are not in the same ideas as always, but they bring in lots of creativity. And that's, I think it's important to realize, because it's part of the essence why this is such a strong topic. I want to recall here the late Wayne Roberts, who unfortunately died last year, but he called food a topic of generative action. It's really generating new type of ways in which we can intervene. You asked about the experience of the city deal. In fact, this has been throughout the city deal. In the city deal, from the start, we chose to look at food policy at the city level on the urban agenda from a number of different topics, different policy areas where we could see that cities were working on that. So there was one group of people working within the city deal, exchanging experiences on the topic of economic innovation and ecological innovation, and other on the topic of health and social inclusion, food education, and a third one on the topic of regional food systems and links with the countryside through short supply chains. And there we could see that these often are very different communities within cities. So we often had now participations from cities with people from 2 or 3 different departments that previously or normally they would not even work so much together, but through the city deal they became aware and engaged in how these topics are integrated and related within the city administration.
Thank you, Henk. We've basically we're hearing that food is a powerful thing. It's a powerful topic, which both in the positive and in the negative sense, in a way. The current food system plays a huge part in our current problems when it comes to climate, biodiversity, and everything else. So it has a very much a destructive aspect. But again, it can also have this very positive aspect. Also in the earlier dialogues, we already heard about food culture. Food is a very enjoyable thing, and it can have all this generative power once you start working on it in an integrated way. I understand. I would like to go back to this idea of integration. So in this field of working as if you want to actually engage in food policy as a municipality or as a district government, of course you are very much acting within your legal framework. If you are a small citizens initiative, you're not supposed to do anything illegal, but your regulatory environment is much simpler in a way. So I would ask actually both of you, maybe starting with Franziska Wolf, what do you see as the main hindering aspects in that regulatory environment, but also enabling factors?
There's a lot of, it depends on what aspect of regional food systems we're talking about. Municipalities and also the state level in Germany, they define different topics to be included in their food strategies. And of course, the legal obstacles and also promoting factors, they depend on the aspect that we're talking. Are we talking about procurement? Are we talking about access to land? Are we talking about planning, etc.? So you have different obstacles. One that has a very practical relevance is really procurement law, because from the perspective of regional food systems, of course, it would be attractive to buy food produced in the region. But in principle, procurement law does not allow for preferential treatment of regional products, because that violates it means that you discriminate against other actors. But luckily, with regard to food, there is a small and kind of indirect means to where you can still that you can use in order to promote the procurement of regional foodstuff. And of course, I'm talking here about German and European procurement law. This is maybe completely different in other regions. So if in a municipality people are thinking about procuring regional food for their schools, for their childcare facilities, etc., the tendering of seasonal food or food that has been grown in greenhouses, that can indirectly lead to the award of contracts to products that come from the region, or at least from an area where the same climate and seasons prevail. So that might be a bit far off than the region, whatever that is exactly. But it prevents products from other climatic zones with long transport distances to be procured. So they are excluded from the procurement process. And another sort of little trick is that the municipality can specify that contractors must be able to guarantee short-term deliveries of food for unforeseen catering orders from the client, etc. So municipalities need to know about these kind of little entry points that procurement law offers, and that also means that procurement staff needs to be involved in those regional food strategies. That would be one sort of also positive outlook.
Henk, I have a question with regards to the Dutch city deal. We have, well, the Netherlands is a pretty small country, and we have like 80 different people from cities in Germany in our audience. As with your experience since 2017, what would you recommend German cities how to get started? Because I think it will be rather difficult to start a national deal like you did, like for the Netherlands. But what can cities do, and what bottlenecks do we have?
Well, I think there are a number of concrete examples of what cities can do, and which in a way also have resulted from the city deal and exchanges between cities within the city deal. One thing that I think is very important within cities, and maybe something that can be done quite easily, is to make like a kind of a place where people working from different policy areas on food, where they meet frequently, some kind of platform. Well, I think it makes very much sense, and that's something that cities can easily do within their municipal structure to make some kind of frequent meeting place for that. The food policies, even food policy councils, I wanted to say, even though these are, I think, much better developed in Germany than in the Netherlands, but they can, I think, also have this function. They can also be a place of integration from policy actions from different departments within the city. I see much more problems still in, and that has been the biggest challenge for the city deal in my respect, even though in unexpected ways we also made progress there, is how to find ways to link city governments with regional governments, because there, one way or another, I mean, it's true also what Francisca said, there are structures there. In the Netherlands, we have got several of this kind of metropolitan regions, which are often collaborations between a city and the rural municipalities. But often well, it's not, I don't want to say often, but it's not always easy to get food there on the agenda. And it's also not always the people who are working in the areas within municipalities on food issues that are at the table in this existing structure. So there is a problem on how you can link that. In the Netherlands, we have the same problem with which I think in Germany would be the Länder, the provinces.
The federal.
Yeah, the federal government. So we've got our provinces, and actually a lot of the responsibilities for the food system traditionally, and also the budgets, they are with provincial governments. And we found out that often the people that are working within provincial policy structures on food and agriculture, they are not very much engaged in all kinds of things related to food system transition. They are much more classic agricultural representative. So one of the things that happened as a kind of sideline within the city deal is that we also made a kind of meeting place, which was called Food on the Provincial Agenda, where we brought together people who from different provincial structures are also working on the issues that the cities are working on. So this also has become like a kind of, meeting place, incubator, where new kind of actions, especially for support of short supply chains, have come up. If I maybe can still say one thing, one of the very big bottlenecks that I still also see, and Francisca referred also a bit to that, is the whole topic of competences. Francisca already said how that it can be a problem around procurement, but this is a topic that is at stake at much more areas, and also, for example, to land. I mean, the competences of a city government ends at the border of the municipality, and then it becomes a responsibility of a rural municipality or a provincial. So very often policy issues that have to do with land, they are not well addressed, because the urban-rural link, it doesn't have a political constituency, and there are no instruments that address it well. Or if they are there, they cannot be applied in an urban setting. Like there are lots of rural development plans, but if you are living in a city, well, you cannot apply to that. That is now slowly changing a bit, but I think there are a lot of issues, and also a need to start developing maybe more new policy instruments and policy arrangements from this integrated urban-rural perspective.
Maybe I can briefly add that we found that in our analysis that an increasing number of financial support programs make it possible that cities and the surrounding municipalities jointly apply to support. So that might apply to climate change issues, adaptation issues, rural development issues as well. So that is a positive thing.
Yeah, farm to fork, I think it's also changing.
Farm to fork?
Well, and the new farm to fork proposals of the Commission. Yeah.
Well, thank you both. We've actually come to the end of our time, but since we're the last of the dialogues in this series, if any of you would like to say, any final thoughts also on what has been talked about before in the first two dialogues, I would just like to give you the floor once more, and then we'll go into our break, I think. Christina?
Yeah, I first explain where to find the experts again in one, but I'll do that later. And then we have a coffee break until 11:45. Francisca, Henk, final statement. How would you conclude our discussion?
I think municipalities interested in developing regional food strategies, they, of course, they should move on their own or jointly with the communities around them. But the federal level in Germany, they should start to support those processes as well. And to date, this is not a big issue at the in the federal government. I mean, there has been the renewal of the Leipzig Charta, which also mentions regional food system, and then there has been a statement by the Staatssekretärsausschuss, Committee of State Secretaries for Sustainable Development, that is also addressing sustainable food systems, but it hasn't got any kind of links to the regional level. So I think there is some homework that the federal government should do, and they should start to support municipalities, build knowledge infrastructures, advice systems, etc.
And Henk, do you have a conclusion, or do you have some last hints and tips for municipalities and cities?
Yes. Well, I want to support fully what Franziska said, and maybe also bring that still one step further. I mean, we have seen a lot of potential, and that is very much also voiced in these different sessions of the Impuls Dialog. Of potentials, what can be done at the local and regional level. But these levels also, they face limits, and these cannot be resolved only at the local level. That needs interventions also at the regional level and also at the national level, which doesn't mean that they need to make more national arrangement, but give space and think how to support these local processes. And another topic I maybe want to mention, and we in this session, maybe we sometimes have been a bit more technical because it's about governments, but I think this issue of democratization is very much linked to this as well. And there is still a lot of the force. You might also say it in a different way, that maybe food is an important area of politicization, and that you can, well, that is sometimes scary for local governments, but it is also something that has a very strong potential. It's a potential to develop new policy agendas, to engage citizens, engage regional companies, and really come to new policy lines that really have impact on the food system.
Thank you very much for you both for being here. Anna, your conclusion, and then we go into the Q&A sessions, 1, 2, 3.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I'm very much looking forward to the Q&A session because it's been so rich. So I think we've opened up a lot of very important topics, and I'm really looking forward to being in the Q&A session as well, and hearing from the practitioners, from the people who are in the different municipalities who've joined us today, what kind of concrete questions they might have, and how or what they might already be doing, and what kind of experiences they might be able to share. And yeah, again, thanks to Henk and Franziska for joining us here, and see you after the coffee break.
Ja, ich würde Ihnen noch ganz kurz erklären. I would quickly like to explain you how you get into